We adjourned to the hospitality room.
Pardon now?
I was just talking to the camera. We adjourned to the hospitality room and enjoyed the view.
That's it. The steel one or the white? The steel. Right here by...
Just, we used to have that building details.
That's where...
The industrial plant.
Well, where
Not the offices, but the manufacturing on industrial.
The first building on...
We're looking at the building where Jack Weldon started, is it?
No.
Is this where Jim Weldon started?
We had a plant there at one time.
Mm-hmm.
It was after we were...
About 1959.
Yeah, it was after we moved to Buckner Boulevard.
Well, I remember when you were on Wood Street.
Yeah, that was...
15... What? I don't know. Right there near the library, Lone Star Gas.
The Orient.
Yeah.
And when did you become part of LTD? That was...
LTV was 59.
Oh. Going back into the 20s and so on, you started out as a ham radio operator in 1920?
I had before that, I guess, because I got a commercial license at 26.
I see.
Telegraph commercial.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, well, we had our consulting firm didn't start until at the end of the war, 1945. And
I see.
Continental was started in 46.
You're coming up 40 years. Yeah, 40 years this December.
That's right.
Yeah, I vividly can see that plaque in your office there. And as I was telling Willie, the most impressive thing is the tube in the case there. I remember that more than anything, that Western Electric tube.
That's the one.
And the history on it.
In Mexico.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And I got that out of Mexico through the help of Mr. Cuesta. And he found out there were 2 of those tubes down there still available. And I told him, get one out for me. And if you get 2 out, you can have the other one. He only got 1 of them out.
Don't ask how he got it out.
Well, see, 8 of them were used in the amplifier, and 1 was a spare, and that was only 9 of them ever built.
9 is all that were able to that.
What if you'd have burned up 2? Be a bit off there.
We didn't lose any.
I know it. That's what the story said. That you run that thing from 1937, 38 to 42 or 3, and never lost a tube. Put all those hours on it and didn't lose any of it.
Yeah, tungsten field. And, let's see, for that 17 kilowatts total was quite a lot at that time.
Yeah.
Was that an AC transformer, or was that a motor generator?
AC.
Yeah.
I used 2-phase, which reduced the hum by 6 dB, but which moved it up to 240 cycles where you could hear it.
I can remember hearing the late Ray Collins, WFA, come and talk about that station. They went down there to see it.
Golly, I hadn't thought of Ray Collins.
He's been dead.
Unbelievable.
35 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Goodness.
He died relatively young of cancer. I think he was about 45 years old.
You made me think of Jim
Cooper.
Jim
yeah,
Cooper.
that's what he made me think of.
Yeah, Jim Cooper just passed away about 5 years ago.
I can tell you one story about Cooper. When we got the contract with Voice of America to build the first megawatt standard band broadcast, I had to get a bond from an insurance company and be bonded to get that contract. And so Rodney Hargrave, who was my banker, took me out to see somebody in the bonding business. And one of the people there was named Cooper, and it was Jim Cooper's brother. So he talked to Jim and said, can that guy really build that transmitter? And Jim Cooper said, sure he can. So I got the bond. And then after we had this transmitter, we got an order for 4 more. They were building them, and I don't think this Cooper had ever seen, not Jim Cooper, but his brother,
yeah, that's right.
anything more than speech input equipment in the studio, and he came out there and saw what we were building. And he says, if I'd have known that this thing was going to be this big and this complicated, I doubt if you'd have got your bond.
I love to tell the story on Jim Cooper that was about him going into a jeweler. This would probably not be over 15 years ago.
Had it left watches.
For repair or something.
Repair.
He reached into his coat pocket to pull out his billfold to pay for it, and the jeweler shot him, thinking he was pulling out a gun. And the
He
jeweler
almost
shot him. Yes, sir.
I heard that
I
on
think some of our guys visited him in the hospital.
Oh, yeah, he was in serious shape there for a couple of months.
I must have known about that.
That guy was over in Lakewood somewhere, and Jim, was real fast moving, And boy, he went for it.
And the guy
With some
shot him.
identification of something, the guy shot it.
Boy.
So
yeah,
trials and tribulations of radio engineering.
But he recovered?
Yeah, he recovered, but he
Where
was.
was the wound?
I don't remember, somewhere down in here, if I remember.
I've tried it.
But,
I guess it's been a bit of a mix-up. I thought all those arrangements had been made through my office, but I guess not.
This is the first
Oh,
time I've heard
I
of
see another swimming pool over here.
Outdoor skating. Well, we'll get you started off. What reminiscences do you have about the 20s and 30s that might be shared with Mr. Weldon's experience?
Well, I just learned from Mr.
Okay.
Weldon the fact that he started out in his career in the 1930s to 31 basis, and I thought that at that particular time he was already a very famously, long famous attachment in the industry. So I must have been wrong on my date, because I didn't actually start my own business till about 1931, but I had been with DeForest working under Alan Dumont at DeForest Radio from 1927 to 1929, 1930, when DeForest collapsed due to the collapse of the stock market. And Alan Dumont took care of his so-called engineers, which I was one, by dividing up the assets of DeForest in the form of test equipment. And my great contribution, the thing that I got from the whole operation, was the number 2 issue of the Ferris signal generator, which is probably the forefather of the Hewlett-Packards and all the rest of them. But Doc Ferris had his little operation in Boonton, New Jersey, and his only source of sales at that time was to the companies in the area, which DeForest Radio was one, being in Passaic, and we got serial number 2 of the Ferris signal generator unit, and Fred Link ultimately got Ferris signal generator number 2 as part of the payment for which DeForest wasn't able to pay us.
Fred, whatever happened to that signal generator?
You mean that Ferris signal generator? Well, I had it when I started my own operation at 157 Chambers Street in New York City. And this was in late 1930s. And as usual, things like that, there was always a problem. And I had it torn apart to try to figure out why we're having a problem, see where the loose connections were, because everything was handmade and so forth at that time. Bill Lear came to New York from Chicago. He was a friend of mine as an amateur radio operator. That's how I knew of him before. He had been working with Paul Galvin in the development of a car radio receiver, not for communication, but for entertainment purposes, which Bill referred to as a Motorola. Well, why not? RCA made a radiola, Victor Talking Machine made a Victrola, Galvin Manufacturing Company is making a mobile radio unit, so it's a Motorola. That's how the name came about. Even I don't think Motorola will admit, but that's how the name came about, I'm sure. But in any case, Bill left Paul Galvin and came to New York, and he knew very few people at that time in New York, but he knew me as a radio amateur. He got in touch with me. Would I mind if he made his headquarters in my little one-room business on Chambers Street? Yeah. Fine. At this particular time, all I had to offer was about 3 employees that hadn't been paid and no business. So Bill, who? Well, that's good. And so Bill was fooling around in this little room, which wasn't any bigger than the room we're sitting in right now, with my whole business. And on the bench was Ferris signal generator number 2, torn apart, laid out. Bill took a look at this. He said, you know, if I knew someone in RCA, I could sell them this idea, this invention. I said, what invention? He said, well, the use of this drum tuner. And I'd call it the magic brain. And I said, well, Bill, this isn't even your invention. He said, who the hell knows? And I said, well, in a case like that, I'll introduce you to the chief engineer of RCA, who I knew Dave Sarnoff at that particular time. So we did. We introduced Bill to that. Now, this you have to take in the context of the time. This is 1931 to 1932. No one had any money. As I say, the people were out in the street selling pencils. This was the bank holiday period. Didn't have anything like that. Bill was introduced to these people at RCA. He went up and talked to them, and he came back and told me, he said, we have to prepare to relocate. He said, because I need a bigger business now for us. For us. I said, fine, why? He said, because RCA just gave me a guaranteed contract for $50,000. Now, keep the context of the time to be their expert on advice on how to exploit this magic brain, which he had sold him, which didn't even belong to him in the first place.
Fred, wasn't this the beginning of the turd tuner?
Yeah, that's sure. This is it.
This was the...
This is it. And now you people who are in the business can understand what I'm talking about.
But
because it was Ferris was the first person to use that turret tuner with the knife points on it that you turn this around to change frequencies.
And where you could have
so all Bill wanted to do is to make something like that so you could change bands, because in the early days of broadcast, I know Bob over there is too young to understand this, but in the early days of broadcast, you worked on the aircraft radio band, the low band, it's almost down to the 100 kilocycles. You know what I mean? To listen above the broadcast, the broadband, and then that's right. And the shipping
but your marine was below broadcast.
That's right. And you get your first band. So the way you change, the way the broadcast tuners changed this time, whether you did it with DeForest honeycomb coils, where you took out a coil and plugged in another one, or you had switching arrangement, which the less efficient circuit simply used a solenoid with taps on it, and they changed this, and of course the performance went worse as you went further down the line on the situation. It had more of this coil hanging on and not used, with the taps. So it was Bill that said, well, look, instead of having this tap coil, we'll have this switch these channels and have a separate coil for a separate frequency range. So each frequency range, a very simple arrangement. It's so simple that obviously that no one thought. But Ferris never patented it. And Bill was able to sell this idea to RCA. Or at least I think he thought he sold it to it. But I do know that we got $1,000 a week to set up a development system at 157, not the 157 Chambers Street at that time, but then we moved to 125 West 17th Street, which I ultimately bought the buildings and so forth. But
Fred, tell them the story about when you would put on one hat and you would be Fred Link, chief engineer,
that's
Bill Lear.
Bill Lear's deal.
Yeah. And then where you built
RCA was going to send people from the RCA company every 2 weeks to see how we were progressing on the developments we were doing. So they would come in, these RCA representatives would come in the building, and Bill would say, well, that's Fred Link. He's my chief engineer over there in the corner, and so forth. And we would work. Bill was the big shot. He sat behind the desk and did this. Then I had my customer in the police radio. They come in, and I said, oh, that fellow over there, he's my chief engineer. That's Bill Lear, and he works over there. And then I sat behind the desk.
Right? You were Link Radio, and he was your...
Lear, he was a situation. But that's That's, but certainly has nothing to do with these famous people here.
Oh, no, Fred, also didn't Bill Lear develop aircraft radio, and didn't he build Howard?
Bill Lear,
He built Howard
I'm sure
Hughes.
Arthur Collins could add to that, but Bill Lear was probably the first person to really provide itinerant aviation communication equipment. I mean, for the low-cost pilot.
Tell him the story about Howard Hughes coming in when he wanted that radio equipment for
These
his,
people have probably dealt with Howard Hughes. They don't have to tell them anything about
No,
it.
but I'm talking about Bill Lear building his radio equipment for that round-the-world flight.
Well, he built the equipment for Amelia Earhart. We built it. I mean, Bill sold it. But and for Wiley Post and for all these people. And if any of you people are aviation nuts or historically aviation nuts, you probably remember some of these names like Roscoe Turner.
Sure. Coast to
Do you ever remember Roscoe, the itinerant nut?
with a handlebar
That's
mustache?
correct.
Sure.
That's the man in his purple tunic. Well, these people all came to our office. I'm trying to think of other people who. Wallace Berry, he bought some of this radio equipment. But Bill was selling this stuff for about $400 or $500 a copy. But the reason he sold it to these itinerant pilots is because it weighed so little. At those days, a person flew an airplane, if they could take 50 pounds off the gross weight, why, that almost made it worthwhile. So here he had a 3-tube receiver, which you call an RA-1 or something like that, a receiver for aircraft purposes. It worked pretty good. And at least it did the job it had to do. And he sold, not a lot, as we know today, but let us say hundreds of them. But in those days, if you sold 100 units of anything, you were solvent. I mean,
How did Howard Hughes act back in those days?
well, I mean, Howard Hughes was one of the customers, but Howard Hughes, even in those days, wore sneakers and blue jeans and so forth. And he would come to get some of Bill Lear's equipment, chisel like mad to get the price down all the time. Then he'd go back to Florida, where he was at that particular time, and he'd call up collect to say he didn't know how to make the thing work and he wasn't going to pay for it. So, but we went all through this. I've had times when Howard Hughes was in my office to see Bill Lear and slept overnight in the office on the couch. Well, these are things that have nothing to do with radio.
No, but they're interesting still.
But I think since you have a man of Jim's historical prominence in this business, that you should exploit what he has done. And I'll simply nod my head and say, yes, ma'am, I was there and I saw it happen.
Well, wonderful. Well, carry on, Jim, wherever you'd like to start.
After that, I don't know where to start.
I mean, but he doesn't lie as much as I do.
How about telling us about your very first contacts with radio?
Well, that was a ham set that I built myself. And they said the way to wind this transformer was craft paper, and I didn't know what craft paper was. I used newspaper. It didn't work too good. But I made it work. I had a 1-tube set with what we call a slop jar rectifier. You know what that is?
No.
That's you have jars with aluminum contacts, one to the other, a whole row of them under the table. And I got about 300-400 volts out of that. A 210, I think was the number of that tube. And I got on the air and called CQ and signed my call letter, and the guy came back and the transformer turned up. So I ran downstairs and said, I've got to order this transformer out of this catalog. And my dad scraped up the money, and then I got back on the air. And I take that back. The first time I sent out a CQ, and the guy came back, all I did was swing the headphones down and run downstairs and say he heard me.
Will you give me a time frame of this? What year are we talking about?
That would be 1921 to 22 of this, because I got commercial license, telegraph operator's license in 26. So that was before that. But that didn't. I had a ham set for a little while there. Then I got into commercial operation, and from a little while on telegraph operation, I went into broadcast business as a broadcast station engineer, and that's where I stayed practically ever since, except went out of the broadcast business itself into engineering and manufacturing.
What broadcast station was that?
First, well, when the Bureau of Standards, the Department of Commerce rather, was running there was no Federal Communications Commission.
Yes, before Federal Radio.
They licensed. They gave portable licenses, so you could build a transmitter, put it in cases in trunks, and haul it around the country and set it up any town you want to go into. So this company was promoting radio shows. This was just in the days when radios were first being made. Most of them were battery sets at water cans, 3B and a few of those. And we'd go into the town and set this transmitter up about 100 watts, maybe 200. And we would advertise the radio show. And we tell people to come down and see broadcasting before your very eyes. And I was the operator and the engineer and usually the announcer in front of these radio shows. And then we'd pack it up after a 2-week show and go to another town. Went to Sheboygan, Wisconsin, or Racine, Wisconsin, somewhere in Iowa, Dubuque, Iowa, and various places. Well, then, all of a sudden, they canceled all portable licenses. And I was with the station in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. And that became the Sheboygan station. The Sheboygan Press took it over. Anyway, another one of those was WIBW in Topeka, Kansas.
Sure.
And Capper Publications took that one. That was one of the portables that we took in there and left it. Of course, they had to buy new equipment. It was real good experience because when you ship a composite transmitter in a trunk by rail, when it gets there, you got a new problem.
Start over again.
You got to make that thing work, rebuild it, of course.
Did you ever work it in the high-powered stations like WLW?
No, I visited with, Jim Rockwell. He was at WLW when that was built, when they went up to the high power. And Joe Chambers there after him.
There was a chief engineer there named Chambers, wasn't it?
Joe Chambers. Joe Chambers.
I remember him.
He went with Motorola out in Phoenix, Arizona.
Speaking of transformers, Fred, tell them about that time you tapped one.
These stories aren't really. But I want to tell you something about this band because to me it's very, very important. I feel like I have a very close relationship with him, which he'd probably want to deny. But the point is that one of his earliest major customers was this Dr. Brinkley, the goat gland specialist from down in the south area.
Del Rio,
and
Texas.
Jim was making his high-powered transmitters on the Mexican border. And that's where I know. Can you give me the year that you were, XEA and XEB and those stations went on the air?
Went there in 31.
31? Well, I mean, now, for example, now that's a point in time. Well, now, one time, Brinkley, and I forget what his first name was.
John R.
It was John Brinkley. That's okay. Because I knew another John Brinkley who was ultimately the managing director of Pi over in England. And he said, yes, he's gotten all kind of problems with his relationship with the name. He was a John Brinkley, too.
People coming to him for operation.
What was the power of those stations on the Mexican border?
The first one
was right over the border from Del Rio, Texas.
Yeah, 60 kilowatts at first, then raised it up to, changed over to high-level modulation, went to 180 kilowatts. And then we put in the Doherty amplifier system, which used those big tubes, 7-foot high tubes. That was 500 kilowatts. And we had a two antennas, directional antenna system, beam north in a cardioid pattern, and I guess we had approximately a megawatt.
They had a standing joke then, said, what was the fastest animal in the world? That was a goat running by Dr. Brinkley's clinic.
Well, I think where I was starting to say, where my relationship came in, this John Brinkley came to New York with his yacht because he made an awful lot of money.
And he kept it in Galveston, Texas.
And he brought this up and had it out in the middle of the Hudson River and stuff. But he gave me the job of putting in an interphone and radio equipment on his yacht. I'm trying to think what year this would be. In other words, it seemed to me it was about 1934 or something. Would that have been about the period of time that he was?
I imagine so.
And
35.
Brinkley wanted to take my wife and myself on his yacht on this trip. This is part payment for the situation. Well, we didn't go. I mean, but the point is, that's how I felt that I got some of this story, which I never knew how true it was, and of course when I tell it, it gets to be even worse. I mean, yeah. John Brinkley, the goat man specialist, and this is a man that made him famous. So
another point of interest is that the tube that I used was developed by Western Electric in anticipation of a change, authorization for 500 kilowatts in this country, which never came. And they developed that tube for that purpose, and we were the only users.
But in
The only place that tube ever went to work was down there.
what was the maximum power that WLW ever experimented with?
500 kilowatts.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
They had three amplifiers and two double modulators. It was high-level modulators. They had three power amplifiers, and they were series combined.
Is that true that they had problems with people complaining of hearing things when they had high power, like if they had a filling in their tooth where it acted as a crystal detector?
We had a technician, Charlie Shelton, that's working in our plant. We were testing high-power transmitters, and every time the transmitter went into a parasitic, he said, "There it goes again." And he could hear it in his hearing aid. Yeah.
But I understand that sometimes fillings in teeth would act as a detector, similar to the Lena crystal detector.
We've had a few stories like that. We were testing 500 kilowatt HF transmitter. There was a plant we had it radiating on about a 17 dB gain antenna. And on the back side of the antenna, one of the neighbors had what we call an ACUDAC AC-DC receiver that they couldn't turn off because it was rectifying in the speaker coils was a little faster.
would you say
We got him a new receiver.
would you say one thing just a little louder? Just one thing, just say it a little louder. I want to make sure it goes in the record. You did say 500 kilowatt.
Yes.
Here's a man that tosses around a 500 kilowatt broadcasting station like we're talking about a crystal.
But better than that, right before this started, we were talking about Art Bullock. I heard him give a talk where he was telling about Continental Electronics building this high-powered Navy station at Cutler, Maine. And I believe you said that was 3 megawatts, didn't you?
2 megawatts.
2 megawatts?
Yeah.
Operating at very low frequencies, down around 15 hertz. 15 kilohertz. 15 kilohertz. And how much did you say that it took for the antenna system?
About 3 square miles.
Okay, that's probably 2 megawatts. And the antenna system.
That's what Harold Wheeler called a small antenna because it was only about 0.05 wavelength high.
But
that
you had
frequency you see.
You had towers supporting a very large copper array, and then you had quite a ground
system. It was just a big
so it acted
capacitor.
like a big capacitor radiating towards the submarines in the Atlantic.
I believe that array was about 1 mile wide, 2 miles long.
Yeah.
On the part that was in the air, about an average of about 1,200, 1,300 feet.
The ground system covered almost 4 square miles.
Don't tell how many linear feet of copper took. How many of those high-powered stations did you build? Was it Cutler, Maine, Jim Creek, Washington?
Well, we modified Jim Creek. That was an RCA transmitter built quite a long time ago. We changed over the tubes, and
How about Balboa, Panama, and
we built Balboa and Little
Hawaii.
and Northwest Cape, Australia. And then we built 3 NATO-funded stations, one in England, one in Norway, one in Tavalara, which is a Mediterranean island for the Italian Navy.
It's amazing how those low-frequency, high-powered stations will get out when you're on board a ship at sea.
Yeah, they got continuous coverage. That's no skip is much advantage of it.
They're just a ground wave.
Yeah. And we worked with Telefunken on one in Germany, Ramsey. Now we sold one to the Indians over in India. Put them on air. A couple of 3 years.
Fred and I have known each other for several years, but it's amazing some of the historical events he's related to me through the years. One of them was meeting Nikola Tesla. Would you tell him the story about the time you met
Now, these two gentlemen will know what I'm talking about. When I go around and tell people, I thought he was the greatest individual engineer in our industry, which he was never recognized as such. And I thought, you have somewhat the same feeling, Jim?
He was introduced alternating, or tried to promote alternating current, the use of alternating current. And
He basically invented alternating
Edison
current.
was a
If it hadn't
DC
been for him, we wouldn't have it.
But didn't Steinmetz actually develop it for GE, though?
No.
I mean, Steinmetz, the application alternating
He
current.
did a lot of theoretical work on it.
Yeah, he was the one, I think, that took the differential equations and converted from the differential equation form to the imaginary J operators to get really handle these things. That's a high point of circuit theory now, it's taught. His contribution is still recognized.
And they wouldn't even allow him in the country at first because he was a hunchback.
Yeah.
No, the time you were telling me about meeting him, I believe, in Grand Central Station.
Well, not in Grand Central, but it was Pennsylvania.
Oh, Pennsylvania Station, okay. But in New York City.
I don't know if that's an interesting story or not, but I met Nikola Tesla through a series of circumstances. The initial circumstances was when I was so-called going to high school, which I only went part-time because I worked rather than went to school during World War I. And they had a debating society. And the debating society, there was 2 debating societies in the school. And I was a member of one of them, and I don't know why or what. But we lost the shuffle, and they were going to have a debate as to the validity of Nikola Tesla's claims. And my society lost out, so we had to defend it. Because by this time everyone had sided with the Edison story, that was the way it was going to be. So the other side took the affirmative, that Edison had the prior value, and that Nikola Tesla was an imposter or something like that. Well, I was on the losing side of the draw and also of the setup. But it made me so damn mad that at that situation that I did a little bit of research, and apparently came up with enough information so when we had the debate, which took the whole school year to prepare for this debate, and the culmination of it was in the so-called graduation week where these 2 societies would debate, and the one who won the debate became the society on the top of the heap for that year. So my group, which had the impossible task of trying to defend Nikola Tesla, we won. We won the debate. So he was always a hero to me. But I had done enough research, so I knew some of his personal habits. So now during the World War II, about 1942, I can't tell you the exact date, instead of eating lunch, I would go to a health club at 34th Street and 6th Avenue, which was known then, that Avenue of America, in the McAlpin Hotel. They had the Roof Health Club. And I'd go there to play handball and do anything else. And then I would walk back to my business, which was in 17th Street, which is some 17 blocks down the street. Well, after you do that for a couple of days, you go different routes. So I go over to 7th Avenue, walk down 7th Avenue. And then you go still different routes. You go to 7th Avenue and walk through Penn Station and go down 8th Avenue and walk around to get there. And one time I was walking through Penn Station and in the pews that they had for this very massive waiting room, 100-foot ceilings and so forth, and there was a person sitting in one of those pews, the waiting room, black formal suit, wing collar, and with a black hat. And I'm not sure what type it was, but it just, to me, that's just the way I've visualized Nikola Tesla. And I, being the kind of a extrovert that I am, I went over to this person and I said, "You couldn't happen to be Dr. Nikola Tesla?" He says, "Yes." And we became very good friends. And so I found out why he would come in there and sit there just to watch people. He was a very great people lover. And he would just sit there and watch people go through the and so forth. Now, I came back from my luncheon period, I'd go over to see when he was going to be there. He had told me he would be there twice a week, and I don't know what the days were. Friday was one day, and I think Tuesday was the other one, that he'd come over there, and I would go through to try to meet him. And I learned an awful lot about the things that he did. Never got any closer than that. We just sit and talk.
Did you say he loved birds too, and pigeons?
Well, then, of course, I heard the story about the fact that he didn't show up for one time that he was supposed to be there. And when he did, when I finally came across him, maybe a week later, I got the story of what had happened. He was very disconsolate. He was very much upset because his pet pigeons, in other words, he lived in the New Yorker Hotel, which arrangement was made for him and probably paid for by General Electric, which at that particular time was trying to atone for their evil of saying he was a no account, and when they were pushing the Edison story. In any case, it was paid by somebody. He had the first telephone in the room that I knew of anyone having in a hotel. But he didn't have a telephone room. The telephone company put in a telephone booth in his room. The telephone booth, because there's no telephone, when you wanted to get someone in the room, you sent a bellboy and told him you're wanted, that you got a call downstairs or something like that. So he had this telephone, which was a frank telephone put in by AT&T. And he had this room that he was given by the hotel, or someone paid for it and taken care of. And so he had a lot of peculiar personal habits. And one of them was extreme fastidious taste. You people know any of his history about his behavior? He is the kind of person who would only wear a shirt one time. He would not even have it washed or cleaned. Wear a shirt one time. And but he opened his windows. You didn't have screens in those days. He opened his windows up, whatever floor it was, up high in the New Yorker Hotel, which was a new hotel at that time. I'm talking about 1942, and the New Yorker was probably built about 1938 or something like that. So, opened his windows, and the pigeons, which are always a problem in New York, would fly up there and sit on the sill. Well, he would feed the pigeons. Well, of course, when you do that, they come back. And they come back, not only come back, but when the weather got bad, he made sure the stuff, and a pair of pigeons made a nest in the telephone booth. So now he wouldn't use the telephone booth because it would upset his pigeons. And so he was talking about these pigeons, that one of them had failed to come back. And he was afraid that the other one was heartbroken. He didn't know what had happened. And he said, if anything happens to this other pigeon, he's not coming back, that he said he didn't know what he'd do. He'd have no desire to live. These were his only friends that he had. Well, some weeks later, he was not at the station, Penn Station. Couldn't find out anything about it, but now I'm curious. So I call the New Yorker Hotel and ask about Mr. Tesla. They said, oh, you didn't know. he died. And I found out, then I went to find out the story. He apparently died of heartbreak. I mean, he was found in bed dead. And his second pigeon had died. They're dead.
I heard that he used to invite people to a dinner in a hotel, and he would take his knife and fork and spoon and clean it with his napkin.
That's
Hand
it.
it to this and take the other person's and
Then do the same thing.
clean the silverware all the way to the table before people eat. Speaking of people, I ought to give a credit line to two people about that tube I was talking about. Bill Doherty with Bell Labs, invented the Doherty high efficiency amplifier, linear amplifier. RCA at that time was building a high level modulated transmitter, and the Doherty transmitter increased the efficiency and was selling real good. And I used that circuit down in Mexico for the 500 kilowatt transmitter. And they sold me those tubes, and they were very anxious that tube not get a bad name, because they anticipated that there'd be 500 kilowatt transmitters granted in this country, and they wanted to have a good name for the tube. So Bill Doherty came down and looked at the transmitter that I had just almost ready to turn on, and he said, yeah, he thought that was going to be all right. And then Dr. Dick Mendenhall, his name is Eugene Mendenhall, but we call him Dick.
I remember the name.
He developed that tube for Western Electric, which was this 7-foot high power tube, and
Were those water cooled?
yeah, water cooled with an integral anode, and the water came in at the bottom and out at the top through two ports, one at the top, two at the bottom. Well, Mendenhall came down and stayed with me while I turned that transmitter on and put the power on those tubes, and we worked together for about a week and a half down there. And fine guy, and so is Bill Doherty, and I've kept in touch with him ever since. Bill Doherty's over in Hilton Head Island, retired there, and I met Mendenhall and Doherty together on Hilton Head about a year ago, and both fine people. I just thought since I used the tube and used Bill's circuit, I probably ought to mention that.
Very
Fred,
good.
speaking of,
Second. I have promised a person from Intellect that I was going to meet them at 3 o'clock, which I don't have to do. I'm hoping that I'll get back.
Okay.
Okay, fine, Fred.
One
Thank
short
you.
question before you leave. When did Bill Lear actually get into developing aircraft? I know that he was a leader in the aircraft radio, but when did he actually?
In aircraft?
Yeah, start experimenting with.
Well,
aircraft?
when after the war, you see, I helped put him in business and making radios during the war because he made my Amtrak 1, 3, and 4 type equipment up at Grand Rapids, Michigan. So he sold what then became Lear Radio to Sears, Siegler. And when he did that, the money he got from that, he had to reinvest right away, so he put this into an operation down in Kansas, Wichita, which became the beginning of the Lear jet. That's what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And that would have been, I don't know, I'll give you time. I'll try to get back here.
Thank you.
Not here when you get back.
Yeah, we
I'm
have
certainly
that.
Glad you had the pleasure of meeting me.
I'm glad I had the pleasure. You're all right. You're just my type. I mean, no.
Okay.
I'll.
Yeah, I have that in focus. That's very
I'll
nice.
try to get
Thank
back
you.
here. Jim, listen.
Okay.
I'm gonna get back to one. Thank you an awful lot for me. See you later. See you all later.
Okay, so long. Well, it was really nice bunch of reminiscences. We really enjoyed that.
I've known Fred for several years. I've heard these stories about Lee DeForest.
This tube
We've been known to
that
do
he's
that.
talking about, there's one of them, the only one left, it's right in the lobby of the office out there on South Buckland Boulevard. You go in the reception area, and you walk in, and there's this big tube in a case, it's got this history all over it. Big old thing is.
Some of these stories that Fred Link is reminiscing of, to realize that he worked with Lee DeForest,
Yeah,
Armstrong,
right.
Dumont,
Mm-hmm.
Bill Lear.
Yeah,
That's quite a span.
it certainly is. I'm so sorry we don't have more on Bill Lear when he was alive. He was quite active.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As long as I'm doing this, may I fix something for you?
Sure, scotch and soda would be real great.
How would you like it, about half and half?
Oh, no, not quite that much. Just a couple of fingers of scotch and the rest soda.
How much scotch?
About two fingers of scotch.
I thought
Okay.
sure you were gonna tell that you went down there to repair that radio.
My gosh, we're all getting on TV around here, I think.
Right.
Don't spoil it, Bob.
You might have run across my desk.
This is real good. You come to the BTG and Bob Fenton becomes the bartender.
A lot of experience. How's that look?
That's perfect. Thank you.
I remember that.
Okay, rest soda?
No soda or water or anything is just good.
There's both soda and water.
Well, no soda is fine. Not no 7-Up, certainly. Soda is fine.
There's another one, I forgot what he did.
He's a club, a golf pro over at, Opry. That's a son of another Collins that I know.
On the third floor, down the fire station.
I
never heard
I
about
thought that somebody said they were gonna tear it out and build residential houses.
Under the swimming pool in the men's swimming pool.
Oh,
Selling off.
From then on, we had to
the
swim in the
property
women's swimming
conditions
pool
out.
downstairs.
okay, that's what
Remember?
it is.
No, I don't remember. I wasn't that active. I usually just.
Television Corporation. Jenkins Television Corporation was a paper company, was a reasonably flat curve. I mean, we said we got to 15,000, but no way in the world you couldn't make an iron core transformer. We said so anyhow. So this was part of the publicity that went with the story. So we made these transmitters, and we put one of them in Jersey City, one in Washington, D.C., which became WTTG later, and one in Boston. And I can't tell you the call letter of Boston for these transmitters. And Johnny Knight and myself were the two people involved, and we went from one to the other, and we put on test programs for a half an hour to an hour, twice a week. Total stock promotion deal. But in any case, we still went into history as having built the first commercial television transmitters in the world for Jenkins Television Corporation. That was DeForest Radio. Now, when that's finished, Dumont, who was the chief engineer, and I was one of the so-called young engineers in the group, what are they going to do with these young engineers that just built these TV transmitters? Well, Dumont said, you're going to be in charge of our power tube division at DeForest Radio. I said, that's fine. I said, I never made a vacuum tube in my life. I don't know anything about it. He said, you're just a man for the job. Because I can tell you something what to do. And he said, if you were smart, you wouldn't pay any attention to what I was telling you. You'd know all the answers. So this is what happened. I became the assistant chief engineer and part of the power tube. This is how I got to know Jim Weldon, because Jim Weldon was searching for a source of tubes. And see, this all ties in together. He was searching for a source of tubes that he could get outside of the cartel, which meant RCA at that time. RCA just started in there, but it's RCA&G and Western Electric. So that's how I got to know him initially, in these tubes. And so that's why I was trying to put into the record the dates of the building of these Mexican stations, XEA and XEB and so forth, because I was trying to get a time frame in there. And he confirmed it was about 1930, which is just about the time that DeForest went out of business. We sold him the tubes, and then we had the collapse to the stock market, the collapse in all the companies. So Dumont's now on his own in business out of Montclair. Red Link's on his own in New York. And I helped set up in Alan Dumont's basement an exhaust machine to make cathode ray tubes, because he developed without a question of doubt the practical cathode ray tube, made television we know it today possible. So in my book, without a question of doubt, Alan Dumont should be credited with being the so-called father of practical television. So that's the story on that. But I have to laugh when I get in the places like Art Collins came to me at DeForest Radio to get tubes in the situation. So we got to be good friends. But we got to be friends because we were amateurs, mainly. And you know how he got in touch with me? Because I had an amateur station on the air, and Luther, this is even before his time, and it was a pretty powerful station. It wasn't a California kilowatt. It was a very efficient 1 kilowatt station. Worked pretty good. And we're heard all over the world and so forth. But you know what you do? And the amateurs in those days, they still do it. They lie a lot, and they do everything else. And they tell everyone, they say, what are you using? Well, I'm using a 203, or I'm using a 202, or something like that, and a push-pull circuit, and all they say. And that's all you'd ever talk about. You'd never talk about anything that made any sense. So you talk about things like that. And they say, well, what kind of tube do you use? Well, I just happen to be using a DeForest tube just developed. Well, where can we get these tubes like that? What's your call letters? And so forth. What's your address? I'll send you one. You'll send us one?
That sounds
sure.
like
well, you know, the reason was becoming very simple. Alan Dumont was an amateur too. And he knew that amateurs never had any money. So they never bought anything. They steal, they do anything else, but they never buy anything. So I went to Alan Dumont. I said, you know what? I said, our attrition rate in manufacturing these power tubes is so bad that I don't see any sense in throwing away these tubes that are workable, but they are impossible to sell because they have defects. For example, our biggest problem was that we couldn't use magnesium getter to get rid of gas, extraneous gas in the tube, and that meant extremely hard exhaust, very high vacuum exhaust. And when you did that, the heat from the plates, where you had to raise the temperature by equivalent to a microwave oven today, I mean in a coil and radio energy, that when you did the heat from these plates in order to drive the gas out, to get the gas out of the elements in the tube, you'd suck in the tubes, you suck in the valve, and everything was done by hand. So you watch this, you have your operators watch this stuff, and they try to get this up to this last critical point, and then all of a sudden you see a suck start to go. Then nothing you can do. Then you'd either throw them away or not. And I said, no, you don't throw them. They're the best ones because they were exhausted to a higher degree, and they would work better. And so I'm using in my amateur sets and these other sets these tubes that you can't sell now. Now I got Dumont to authorize me to give them to amateurs like an Arthur Collins. And so Arthur Collins and these other people would say and these sets, well, I'm using these new DeForest tubes. They wouldn't sell it. They had a sucked in an envelope or something like that. But they worked like mad, and that's how we were getting our business. So it worked out very, very well. But as a result, it's a very great treat for me to have these two people who, like Art Collins said downstairs when we were having lunch on the situation. He said, I remember the days where I'd have been out of business if you hadn't been able to supply me tubes. And I said, yeah, I'd have been out of business too if you hadn't taken them. I mean,
you hadn't taken.
But it was just great to talk to people like that. But here, my good friend over here, Al, taking these stories, listening to me tell these crazy, worthless stories. When you had these kind of people, you should have been listening to them.
They're gems.
But they wouldn't. They're just too reticent and too honest. They wouldn't get in there.
Well, I'm sorry I missed Mr. Collins.
Well, I tell you, you're one of the people that asked me about telling you some of these stories on these times. Yes, you would have enjoyed it. I mean, you would have enjoyed the fact that these, to me, they are all part of the history of my life, but it was an awful lot of fun when I look back over it. And then when I start to analyze the fact that the people who made it, what it was, are the people who are big names in the industry. I mean, that have gone on and done something on their own. Now, you had two of the men here today, Jim Weldon and Art Collins, that I consider to be some of the really legitimate pioneers in our business. I wish I could stack up with them, and I don't have to as long as I lie the way.
I wish when I was a young man I could have afforded one of his receivers.
What's that?
Collins receivers?
Yeah, I say I wish when I was a young man
You could afford one
I
of the
could
Collins?
have afforded one of his receivers.
Well, when you were a young man, those receivers were already in the 10th generation.
Yeah, they were.
I mean,
We're
if
thinking about
you'd been talking about the early ones, when he was making amateur receivers in the beginning.
He still made some mighty nice amateur receivers.
Oh, he
and,
makes some of the best, there's no question
It
about
was
that.
in the 50s. He was still making a fine product.
No question about it.
But that was 10th generation. You're right.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, what I'm talking about, of course, is this stuff that went back in the earliest days. It's just great. But I do feel that Al made an unfortunate mistake in not centering his interests and his questions on these people.
On what?
That's enough, isn't it?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, he gave a paper.
Well, you see,
That made all the difference in the world.
Or someplace else.
you probably know this,
I was
maybe you
chairman
don't,
or-
but in the early days of Art Collins' career, he was a bench engineer. He did the work. And that's what, he wasn't the kind of person who sat in an office and someone else did
Well,
it.
Roy Matthews teamed up with him,
back at work.
I guess 1934.
Well, that would be about the time I'm talking about, because he said that he only started around 1930, 1931, which is the same time that I started, but I felt that when I started in my own business, that Collins was already an established setup because I had sold him tubes during my career at DeForest Radio, and I know that career came to a grinding halt about 1930, 1931 with a...
With the Depression.
Yeah. And so I was trying to figure that date on the thing, and because there's no question about it, I considered him an established, important figure in the business.
Well,
Before I started my own business, which I started in 1931.
anybody that'd been in a whole year at that time was established, wasn't it?
I guess so.
As new as
I
it
guess
was.
Well, Fred, Art built some of the first equipment that went on the Bird Antarctic expedition.
Who?
Art Collins
Well, of
did.
course he
In the
did.
basement of his uncle's home
He
in Cedar
did.
Rapids.
He
And
did.
what year was that, 27 or 28?
For the first expedition, it went on about 1928.
Okay.
And that was as a result of something else that I was involved in. And of course, when you get involved in things, you get an Art Collins who is your friend because you knew him from something else. And you knew him from the other activity, recommends to do the things. Actually, Art Collins supplied the equipment for the second.
Was it the second?
Yes.
Okay, I'm in there.
Because the first equipment for the first expedition, they didn't even know whether the boat would get to the Antarctic.
Okay.
Never even knew if it got there or would ever get back. And so it was very limited setup financially and everything else. I mean, it was a marginal operation. And the equipment for the most part that was used in that initial expedition was jury made, amateur made. And I don't think Art Collins was involved in that.
Okay, then I'm in there. It must
But
be
the second one, which was now financed and heavily financed and bankrolled and so forth, he supplied the equipment, definitely.
Yeah.